I'm looking for a place that's gonna collect my commission, sell my dog, burn my bird, and sell me to the cigarette. You know, I don't like to hear that kind of thing.
Like if you just do it with one guy or a few guys, that'd just take it all out of context, you know?
New York City, 1986. Bob Dylan walked into the Bitter End nightclub with a guitar slung over his shoulder and a quiet plan to surprise the crowd with an acoustic set. He never made it to the stage. Before the mic, before the applause, someone slipped him a folded note. Just 3 words, a name. He looked at it, froze, and then without a word turned around and walked straight out into the freezing night. No show, no explanation, no return. The crowd never knew what happened. But those closest to Dylan did not need to ask. They understood exactly what that name meant. Because for decades, Dylan had kept a list. Not a hit list. Not a list of enemies. But a silent ledger of people who had once meant something. People he admired, respected, trusted, and then quietly erased. No diss tracks, no public takedowns, just pure, pointed silence, and that silence in Dylan's world spoke louder than anything he ever wrote. Now, at 83, the man who built his career on ambiguity is letting parts of that silence slip. Not to start fights, not to settle scores, but to finally tell the truth. Because every name on that list were not just fellow artists, they were reflections of something deeper, something Dylan could not ignore. And the reason he walked away from each one? That story is finally ready to be told.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it could have come off maybe a couple cemetery tombstones.
Eric Clapton. To the outside world, Bob Dylan and Eric Clapton looked like kindred spirits, 2 titans of music who had carved their names into the fabric of rock history. Dylan, the poetic rebel. Clapton, the blues virtuoso. They shared stages, traded compliments, and stood at the epicenter of a generation's soundtrack. Clapton once called Dylan the greatest poet in music, and coming from someone as famously reserved as Clapton, that kind of praise did not go unnoticed. For years, fans imagined the two as creative allies, men who understood each other's brilliance, maybe even drew inspiration from one another. But behind the scenes, the story was very different. Because Bob Dylan does not always speak with words, he speaks with silence. And when it came to Clapton, that silence arrived suddenly and never left. It happened sometime in the late 1970s. Dylan was deep into one of his most controversial periods, his gospel phase. He had turned towards spiritual themes, writing songs about salvation and faith, deliberately pushing away fans who wanted protest anthems or heartbreak ballads. For Dylan, it was personal evolution. For others, it was baffling. Meanwhile, Clapton was thriving. He had reinvented himself as a solo artist, leaving Cream behind and leaning into blues rock superstardom. His career was riding high. The contrast between the two was striking, and that is when everything cracked. According to industry insiders, Clapton made a comment. It was not during an interview. It was not said on a stage. It was behind closed doors, reportedly over drinks with a mutual producer. Clapton allegedly said that Dylan had lost his edge, that he was not the same voice of a generation anymore, that the poetic crown might be ready for someone else to wear, and maybe that someone was him. It was not an attack, not exactly, but it was not gentle either. And once those words traveled back to Dylan, something shifted. He did not call Clapton, did not ask for clarity. He did not rage or defend himself. Instead, he canceled a quiet recording session they had been planning. No explanation, just silence. For Dylan, that kind of move was not impulsive. It was surgical. When someone crossed a line he could not uncross, he did not argue. He just disappeared. There were no headlines about a feud. No public quotes. No tabloids speculating about a rift. But insiders noticed. They stopped seeing the two together. Collaborations that had once seemed inevitable quietly evaporated. And Dylan, who had once spoken warmly about Clapton's talent, grew cold, measured, vague, diplomatic whenever the subject came up. He never criticized Clapton directly. He did not have to. In Dylan's world, the absence of warmth is louder than any insult. What hurt Dylan was not just the criticism, it was the betrayal. Because Clapton was not just some journalist or fan questioning his direction. He was a peer, a supposed equal. Someone who understood what it meant to put your soul into a song and risk being misunderstood. For Clapton to suggest, however lightly, that Dylan was fading, that was not a critique of the music, that was a rejection of the man behind it. Dylan, fiercely protective of his art, took it personally, deeply. He began to see Clapton's charm and calm demeanor as something else. Performance, a mask, smooth on the surface, but self-serving underneath. And yet, Dylan never publicly shut the door. He did not write a scathing verse or pen a cryptic lyric, but the energy changed, invitations stopped, collaborations vanished. And though Clapton continued to praise Dylan in public over the years, Dylan never really returned the favor. When asked, he would say little, smile faintly, move on. To fans, it looked like diplomacy. To those who knew him, it was a quiet exile. Because that is how Bob Dylan handles betrayal. He does not explode. He evaporates. And when that door closes, it does not slam, it vanishes. Just like he did that night at the bitter end in New York, slipping into the cold with no explanation, carrying only his guitar and a truth he refused to share. For Eric Clapton, that truth had already been written, and it was silent.
You call yourself what you want to call yourself. This is the land of the free.
Joan Baez. There was a time when Bob Dylan and Joan Baez were not just two of the most powerful voices in folk music, they were the heartbeat of a movement. In the early 1960s, they were inseparable. On stage, their voices blended like echoes from the same soul. Off stage, they were more than collaborators. They were companions, confidants, partners in protest and poetry. Together, they sang for freedom, for peace, for justice. Their music was not entertainment. It was a lifeline for a generation aching for change. To fans, they were the king and queen of folk. To each other, they were lightning in a bottle. But like all great duets, what made their harmony so powerful also made their silence unbearable. And when it came, it did not crash, it faded. Quietly, permanently. The fracture was not caused by jealousy or infidelity or petty drama. It was something far more painful. It was values, vision, the heart of what they believed music was supposed to do. Joan Baez had always seen music as a weapon for good, a call to action. Her songs were banners, her voice was protest, and in Dylan she saw a kindred soul, at least at first. But Bob Dylan was never content to stand still. By 1965, he was shifting, not just his sound but his purpose. He did not want to be a protest singer forever. He did not want to be the spokesman for every cause. He wanted to grow, evolve, explore, and that is when he plugged in. At the Newport Folk Festival, Dylan shocked his audience by going electric, trading his acoustic guitar for a plugged-in Stratocaster, turning protest into poetry and ideology into art. The boos from the crowd were deafening. But the loudest silence came from Joan. She did not just disapprove. She felt betrayed. To her, Dylan's shift was not evolution. It was retreat, abandonment, a desertion of the very cause that had brought them together. She said so publicly. In interviews, she accused Dylan of losing his way, of turning his back on the fight. She said his lyrics had become self-indulgent, that he had stopped singing for the people and started singing for himself. Dylan did not respond. Not in interviews, not in music, not even in private. But those words cut deeper than any review ever could. Because Joan Baez was not just another critic. She was someone who had stood beside him on the picket lines, who had seen him at his most vulnerable, who had believed in him when the world did not understand him. Her criticism felt personal, like a blade slipped between the ribs, not out of malice but disappointment, and Dylan never forgot it. Over the next 4 decades, the distance between them grew. Duets were declined, invitations ignored. When they crossed paths at award shows or retrospectives, the warmth was gone. The harmony had evaporated. In one rare interview, Dylan was asked directly about Joan. His response? Just 6 words. "She sang for the people. I did not." It was not arrogance. It was honesty. Because for Dylan, music had stopped being a mission. It had become a mirror, and he could not share that mirror with someone who only saw what he used to be. Fans hoped for a reunion, a moment on stage where the two voices that once defined a revolution would rise together one more time. But that moment never came. And the silence between them became its own kind of legacy, a reminder that even the most powerful connections can unravel when their purpose splits in two. In the end, what broke them was not hatred. It was heartbreak. Baez stood for the world Dylan walked away from, and every time he heard her voice, it echoed with a version of himself he had outgrown. A version he could not return to even if he wanted to. That is why this rift stings deeper than most. Because it was not just the end of a partnership, it was the quiet death of a belief that music could save the world, as long as the right people were singing together. Lou Reed. Bob Dylan never feared rebellion. He was born from it. From the moment he stepped onto the scene in the early 60s, Dylan was a storm in human form. Disruptive, unpredictable, and unstoppable. Critics could not box him in. Fans could not keep up. Even his own peers did not always understand him. But Dylan did not care. He kept moving, kept writing, kept changing. The only thing he demanded, quietly but fiercely, was respect, not applause, not worship, just the respect of being taken seriously. But in the mid-1970s, one voice cut through all the noise, not with critique but with contempt. That voice belonged to Lou Reed, and the wound it left never healed. Lou Reed was not a subtle man. As the frontman of the Velvet Underground, he built a career on provocation. He did not just challenge norms, he lit them on fire. His music was gritty, raw, and unapologetically abrasive. And for a while, that made him and Dylan seem like two sides of the same coin. Two poets navigating chaos, each in their own way. But Lou Reed did not admire Dylan. In fact, he seemed to take pride in tearing him down. In a now infamous interview during the height of Dylan's 70s output, Lou Reed smirked his way through a brutal takedown. He dismissed Dylan's lyrics as smoke and mirrors, accused him of hiding behind metaphor, and labeled him a symbol, not an artist. He did not stop there. Reed went on to say Dylan's fans were fooled, worshipping complexity where there was none, projecting depth onto a man who in his eyes had none to begin with. It was more than an insult. It was mockery, and Dylan heard it. But Dylan did not fight back. Not in Rolling Stone, not in a song, not even in private. Instead, he deployed the one weapon he wielded better than anyone else: erasure. From that moment on, Lou Reed ceased to exist in Dylan's world. He was not acknowledged. Not in liner notes, not in memoirs, not in tributes. For a man like Dylan, who subtly name-dropped his peers in verses and paid homage to those who moved him, that absence was deafening. Reed had crossed a line. Not by disagreeing with Dylan's music, but by laughing at the man who made it. Years passed, but the silence never broke. Then came the moment that solidified everything. In the early 1990s, a journalist interviewing Dylan casually mentioned Lou Reed. Dylan, cigarette in hand, looked up and said one word: "Who?" And then he smiled. It was not confusion. It was not sarcasm. It was a statement, a final one. That word, "who," was not just dismissal. It was erasure, the kind that is colder than any insult and sharper than any lyric. The irony is, Lou Reed probably would have worn Dylan's silence like a badge. He thrived on antagonism, on rattling icons, on poking at sacred cows. But Dylan was not just an icon. He was a man who had bled through his verses, who built his life on metaphor because literal life was often too painful. For Reed to strip that away, to laugh at it, to reduce it to pretense was not edgy, it was cruel. And Dylan, who could forgive rivals, who even made peace with past critics, never made space for Lou Reed again. Not because he hated him, but because he never saw him the same way again. Respect, once lost, was gone forever. In Dylan's universe, silence is not absence. It is punishment. It is the final verse of a song that does not need to be written. And for Lou Reed, who believed himself untouchable, that silence was the most piercing line Dylan never sang. Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa did not believe in boundaries. He mocked institutions, ridiculed politicians, laughed at fans, and steamrolled sacred cows for sport. To some, he was a genius provocateur. To others, a noise merchant with a sharp tongue and sharper disdain. But whatever people thought of him, one thing was clear: Zappa did not care. He tore through the music industry with a smirk, refusing to conform, refusing to flatter, and refusing especially to revere legends. And Bob Dylan? He was a legend. But in Zappa's world, that only made him a bigger target. The irony? Dylan might have respected Zappa's rebellion if it had not been aimed squarely at him. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Zappa rarely passed up an opportunity to take a swipe at Dylan. In interviews, he scoffed at Dylan's tragic voice, mocked his lyrics as pseudo-intellectual ramblings, and even ridiculed his audience, calling Dylan fans brainwashed sheep who think they are enlightened. He did not critique Dylan's music. He humiliated it. He did not analyze the songwriting. He laughed at the mythology. Most artists wrote it off as Zappa being Zappa, a man who never turned off the sarcasm. But Dylan was not most artists. He did not care about controversy, but he cared deeply about dignity. And Zappa's words did not just cut, they humiliated. And Bob Dylan never forgot humiliation. True to form, Dylan never responded. There was no war of words, no musical rebuttal, no public eye roll, just distance. Frank Zappa was never mentioned, never acknowledged, never referenced in the way Dylan was known to quietly tip his hat to those he respected, even his rivals. In Dylan's world, silence is never casual. It is surgical. And the absence of a name is often louder than its presence. But it was not until the early 1980s that the unspoken rift played out in public. A party in Laurel Canyon, a haze of wine, weed, and whispered gossip. Musicians mingled like ghosts of past glories, and fate decided to put Dylan and Zappa in the same room. Not planned, not expected, just cosmic irony doing what it does best. A mutual friend, hoping to break the ice, nudged the two men together. Dylan did not move, did not speak, did not even make eye contact. The room stiffened. Everyone sensed it. The tension, the freeze, the emotional armor Dylan had slipped on like a shield. And then, Zappa, true to form, broke the silence with a joke. "I hear silence is your best verse," he quipped, raising a glass, voice thick with smug irony. People laughed, nervously. It was classic Zappa, blunt, mocking, clever. But Dylan did not flinch, did not blink, did not speak. He just turned, walked out of the party, and never came back. That was not retreat, that was finality. Zappa had spoken one too many lines, and Dylan was not going to dignify it with a response. Because Dylan understood something Zappa did not. When a man builds his life on words, silence can hurt more than any lyric ever could. In the years that followed, their paths never crossed again. Dylan never addressed the party, never commented on Zappa's barbs. And when Zappa passed away in 1993, Dylan's reaction was as cold as their final meeting. No tribute, no quote, no nod. Just the sound of a door that had already been shut years ago, staying shut. To Zappa, it was all performance. To Dylan, it was personal. Because Zappa did not just disagree with Dylan, he ridiculed the essence of him, his voice, his fans, his purpose. He did not critique a verse, he questioned Dylan's right to sing at all. And for Dylan, that was not forgivable, not in this life. So while Zappa may have gotten the last laugh at the party, Dylan got the last word without saying a thing. His silence, measured and deliberate, became the only verse Zappa never got to play with. And in Dylan's story, that silence still echoes. Leonard Cohen. Of all the names Dylan ever drifted away from, Leonard Cohen is the one that hurts the most. Not because of any explosive betrayal, but because of what never got said. There was no fight, no insult, no dramatic walkout, just a slow, silent unraveling between two men who spoke the same language, only in different dialects. Dylan once called Leonard Cohen the highest level of songwriting, a rare, almost sacred compliment coming from someone who rarely handed them out. And Cohen, in return, called Dylan the Picasso of song. On paper, their respect was mutual, their bond unbreakable. But in the quiet space between the verses, something began to fracture. And when it did, it left behind a void that never healed. It started in the late 1960s. Dylan was retreating from the spotlight after his motorcycle accident, disappearing into family life and spiritual seeking. Meanwhile, Leonard Cohen was rising. A different kind of poet, softer, more composed, more precise. Where Dylan's words sprawled in metaphors and gravel, Cohen's floated like whispers from a monastery. He did not write to provoke, he wrote to understand. And soon, critics and fans alike began drawing comparisons. Some even suggested Cohen had gone deeper than Dylan ever had. That he had refined the raw poetry Dylan once wielded like a sword. Dylan, for all his mystery, heard it, and he did not like what it reflected. Then came the interview. Early 1970s. Leonard Cohen, thoughtful and measured as always, was asked about Dylan's early work. He paused, then offered a gentle critique, saying Dylan's early lyrics were juvenile compared to mature poets. It was not meant to hurt, it was not meant to dismiss, but it landed like a hammer. Because to Dylan, those early songs were not just lyrics. They were life, they were survival. They were the voice of a kid from Minnesota who clawed his way into history using nothing but truth and a typewriter. For Cohen to reduce that to youthful missteps, even diplomatically, felt like betrayal. Not loud, but sharp. Not cruel, but devastating. Dylan never confronted him. He never fired back. But the warmth vanished. He stopped referencing Cohen in interviews, stopped praising him, stopped acknowledging the impact they had on each other's work. For decades, they circled the same world, admired by the same fans, celebrated by the same institutions. But they never really met in the middle again. The connection that once felt unspoken became unspeakable. Years passed. Awards were handed out. Tributes were written. Dylan won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Cohen congratulated him in a press conference, and even joked that giving Dylan the prize was like pinning a medal on Everest. It was classy, gracious, even beautiful. But Dylan? He said nothing in return. Not publicly, not privately, nothing. Then in 2016, Leonard Cohen died. His passing rocked the music world. Fans across the globe wept, clutched their copies of Suzanne and Hallelujah, and waited for Dylan, Leonard's greatest peer, to say something, anything. What came instead were 3 lines. No memories, no emotion. Just a flat statement acknowledging that Cohen had been deeply influential. That was it. For someone who wrote verses about rain, rivers, revolutions, and heartbreak, Dylan had never sounded more hollow. And for those who understood their history, the silence inside those 3 lines said more than any tribute could. Because Dylan did not hate Leonard Cohen. He feared what he saw in him. Cohen was disciplined, measured, spiritual in a way that did not require reinvention. And maybe that is what made Dylan pull away. Cohen reflected the poet Dylan sometimes wished he could be. The one who did not have to burn bridges or close doors to survive. The one who did not turn on people just to stay true to himself. And when that mirror got too clear, Dylan did what he always did. He turned away. This was not a feud, it was grief. Grief over what their friendship could have been. Grief over being misunderstood by the only person who might have understood him completely. And once that distance settled in, it never closed. So when the world mourned Leonard Cohen with candlelight and verse, Bob Dylan did what he always did when the pain cut too deep. He said almost nothing. And in doing so, he said everything. Michael Bloomfield. Michael Bloomfield was not just another name in Bob Dylan's orbit. He was the lightning bolt, the electric jolt that transformed Dylan from a folk prophet into a rock revolutionary. When Dylan shocked the world by plugging in at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, it was Bloomfield's furious, untamed guitar that lit the fire. That moment did not just shift Dylan's sound, it rewired the entire music landscape. Highway 61 Revisited became a landmark album, and Bloomfield's raw, searing guitar work turned Dylan's poetry into thunder. To Dylan, Bloomfield was not a session player. He was a kindred soul, a trusted force. Which is why what happened next did not just bruise, it broke something. In the aftermath of Highway 61, Dylan wanted Bloomfield by his side, on stage, in studio, on whatever strange path he wandered next. But something started changing. Invitations were declined. Recording sessions missed. Messages unanswered. At first, it was brushed off as scheduling. Then maybe nerves. Then something darker. Rumors of addiction, anxiety, fear of fame. Whatever the truth was, Bloomfield began drifting, and Dylan felt it deeply. Because to him, Bloomfield was not just another musician. He was the man who had helped him rebirth his sound, someone Dylan had opened his creative world to. That kind of trust was not given freely, and now it felt like it was being returned unopened. Dylan did not lash out. He rarely did. He just moved forward quietly, efficiently, with that same stone-faced focus that made him impossible to read. But the real fracture did not come from Bloomfield disappearing. It came later, when he reappeared in interviews. Because instead of reflecting on their groundbreaking work with reverence, Bloomfield began reframing history, telling stories that made it sound like he had saved Dylan's career, that Dylan had been floundering, that Bloomfield's guitar had given him the edge he desperately needed, that Dylan's pivot to electric rock was in many ways Bloomfield's idea. To outsiders, it might have sounded like harmless musician bravado, but to Dylan, it was betrayal. Because those sessions were not a rescue mission. They were a collaboration, a sacred creative space. And now Bloomfield was standing in the spotlight, quietly recasting himself as the architect of Dylan's reinvention. Dylan did not scream. He did not correct the record. He just closed the door. From that point on, the mentions stopped. The praise stopped. Bloomfield, once hailed as Dylan's secret weapon, was left out of the mythology. Not erased, but left behind. The warmth Dylan once spoke with was replaced by distance. The trust, gone. The bond, silently severed. And then came the end. In 1981, Bloomfield was found dead in his car, the victim of an apparent drug overdose. He was only 37. His death sent shockwaves through the music world. Another brilliant light snuffed out too soon. Tributes poured in. Fellow musicians remembered his soul, his speed, his sound. But from Dylan, silence. No statement, no anecdote, no song. Just absence. That same cold, deliberate absence that Dylan always reserved for the people who had once mattered the most. To understand Dylan's reaction, you have to understand what Bloomfield represented. He was not just a collaborator. He was a symbol of a moment when Dylan broke free, when he turned his back on the folk purists and followed the noise in his soul. And when Bloomfield faded, it was not just a musical loss. It felt like abandonment. When Bloomfield later rewrote that history, Dylan did not just lose a partner. He lost the purity of that moment. And to a man who built his identity on transformation, that kind of loss is hard to forgive. So Dylan did what he always did when something hurt too much to name. He locked it away. Not with cruelty, with silence. And in doing so, he turned one of rock's most electrifying partnerships into a ghost story. One that still haunts the space between their records, lingering in the empty space where friendship used to live. Paul McCartney. On paper, Bob Dylan and Paul McCartney should have been lifelong allies, titans of songwriting, two of the most influential musicians of the 20th century. Both reshaped music in their own image. Dylan with his jagged poetry and philosophical grit, McCartney with melodies so smooth they felt inevitable. They moved in the same circles, graced the same stages, collected the same awards. But for all the surface-level warmth, their relationship was always cool, polite, distant, because while Dylan found a kindred rebel in John Lennon, he saw something very different in Paul. Something polished, predictable, safe. Dylan respected McCartney's gift for melody. He had even called him the only one who has never made a bad record, a statement that sounded more like a riddle than a compliment. But that respect never felt personal. There was no deep bond, no private connection. When the Beatles broke through in the United States, Dylan admired their rise, but connected more with Lennon's edge than Paul's charm. And as the years rolled on, that emotional distance only grew. Because for Dylan, McCartney was everything he never wanted to become: universally liked, endlessly marketable, always smiling for the crowd. There was never a dramatic fallout between them, no explosive moment, no betrayal, just a steady drift between two artists who wrote in completely different emotional languages. Dylan bled into his songs. McCartney polished his. Dylan was the sound of a soul unraveling. McCartney was the sound of a perfect Sunday morning. They did not clash. They just could not connect. And then, in 1987, something shifted. In a magazine interview, McCartney made a comment. It was casual, offhand. Probably not meant to hurt. But it landed like a slap. He said Dylan was not writing songs people could remember anymore. Just like that. As if it were a simple observation. But to Dylan, who by then had long left behind radio-friendly hooks in favor of dense, symbolic introspection, those words did not feel casual. They felt surgical. As if McCartney was reducing years of artistic evolution into irrelevance. As if all that spiritual digging and lyrical rawness did not matter because it was not catchy. Dylan did not respond publicly. He did not write a song. But something snapped. That same year, plans were quietly in motion for a joint tour, an idea that had been floated by insiders for years. A dream pairing. A celebration of two legacies. After that interview, Dylan pulled out. The excuse? Bad timing. But everyone close to the situation knew better. Dylan did not do confrontations. He did disappearances. Privately, Dylan was more direct. According to those close to him, he muttered a single line that summed up everything. Paul writes love letters, I write scars. And that was not just a poetic jab, it was a worldview. McCartney wrote to comfort. Dylan wrote to confess. And in that one quote, Dylan drew the line that had always been there, invisible but sharp. Over the years, they remained cordial, shared brief moments at award shows, smiled for the cameras, even posed together in photos that sent fans into fits of nostalgic joy. But the warmth? It never came. There were no deep collaborations, no duets, no mutual interviews looking back on the good old days. Because for Dylan, there never were good old days with Paul, just two men walking parallel paths. Close enough to wave, but never close enough to speak the same emotional language. And maybe that is what made this particular rift feel so sad. It was not about betrayal or disrespect. It was about incompatibility. McCartney was the pop genius who wanted to be loved. Dylan was the reluctant prophet who did not care if he was hated. And when McCartney made that single comment about memorability, he unknowingly confirmed everything Dylan had always feared. That in the eyes of polished perfection, Dylan's raw honesty would always look like a flaw. So Dylan did what he always did. He did not shout. He did not argue. He just walked away, quietly, permanently. Not because he hated McCartney, but because he knew they would never hear the same song in the same way. By now, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Bob Dylan did not explode. He did not confront. He did not defend himself in the press or strike back with diss tracks. He vanished. One by one, the names fell away. Eric Clapton, Joan Baez, Lou Reed, Frank Zappa, Leonard Cohen, Michael Bloomfield, Paul McCartney. Different people, different stories. But every ending looked the same. Silence. No dramatic headlines. No farewell phone calls, just Dylan turning away, slowly, finally. And for those who understood him, or thought they did, it became clear. This was not avoidance. It was design. Because in Dylan's world, silence was not weakness, it was punishment. It was not that Dylan lacked the words. He always had the words. But when it came to betrayal, especially the kind that was not loud but subtle, quiet, surgical, he chose to respond in kind. With absence, with erasure, with that terrifying stillness that made people realize they had been cut off not by accident, but by intention. He did not scream, "You hurt me." He just removed you from the frame. And when Dylan removed you, it was like you were never there. But why silence? Why that specific, cold, final act? The answer lies in who Dylan was beneath the lyrics, behind the mythology. Bob Dylan was not just a songwriter, he was a fortress. For decades he had been misquoted, misunderstood, mythologized, dragged into movements he never asked to lead. The world projected meaning onto him like a screen, and he let them because fighting it was exhausting. But privately, Dylan had rules, boundaries. And when someone crossed those, especially someone he once trusted, the punishment was not public shame, it was emotional exile. And what made it worse? Every person on that list did not start as an enemy. They started as reflections, people Dylan admired, collaborated with, shared pieces of himself with, which made the betrayals feel sharper, more personal. Clapton's comment was not just about music. It questioned Dylan's soul. Baez's disappointment was not professional. It felt like abandonment. Reed did not just criticize. He mocked Dylan's very identity. Zappa turned Dylan's vulnerability into a punchline. Cohen, the one peer Dylan may have feared most, held up a mirror that showed Dylan aging, slipping, losing the edge. Bloomfield took something sacred and spun it into ego. And McCartney Paul did not mean to hurt Dylan, but his casual dismissal proved they were never really in the same world to begin with. Silence then became Dylan's way of taking back control, of drawing the line. Not to hurt, but to survive. Because the man who spent his life crafting verses understood something that most people did not. That some betrayals cannot be answered with lyrics. They live too deep, they rot at the roots. And singing about them would only give them more power. So he buried them. Quietly, completely. And that is why the silence always rang louder than any song. Because every time Dylan shut a door, he was not just walking away from a person, he was walking away from a version of himself, the idealist, the romantic, the friend, the believer. Each fracture carved off a piece of his past, and with it, a piece of his heart. So he chose distance, disappearance. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. And what makes it even more tragic is this. Dylan, for all his genius, never learned how to mend those silences. He could write songs that moved nations, but he could not make the first call. Could not send the text. Could not say, "I miss you." So the silences hardened, turned permanent, and what might have started as a momentary wound became a life sentence of regret. Because when you live behind a wall of myth, even the softest betrayal echoes like a gunshot. And Dylan's silence? That was his armor, his punishment, his goodbye. So what was this list, really? Not a vendetta, not a tally of enemies. It was something much heavier. These were not casual fallouts or showbiz spats. They were deeper, personal, irreversible. Bob Dylan did not cut ties over ego or competition. He walked away from people who, in his eyes, stopped seeing him clearly, not as a legend, not as a performer, but as a man. A fragile, evolving, imperfect man trying to hold on to himself while the world turned him into myth. Each name, Clapton, Baez, Reed, Zappa, Cohen, Bloomfield, McCartney, marked a turning point. A moment where Dylan felt misunderstood, betrayed, or diminished by someone he once trusted, and every time it happened, he chose the same response: silence. Not to be petty, not to stir controversy, but because silence, to Dylan, was not empty. It was final. The last verse of a chapter he no longer wanted to write. And that silence? It was not just a message to those he left behind. It was a message to himself, a reminder of where he had come from, and of everything he could not go back to. Each door he closed was not just shutting someone out. It was shutting out a version of himself that hurt too much to carry forward. The idealist who thought music could save the world. The friend who believed artistic loyalty meant permanence. The young man who thought honesty would be enough. Maybe that is why Dylan's silences still echo louder than most people's screams. Because they were never just about pride or pain. They were about transformation. And the cost of it. At 83, Bob Dylan is not out to settle scores. He is not naming names to stir headlines. He is just telling the truth. Finally, the unvarnished, uncomfortable truth about what it cost him to stay Dylan all these years. The friendships he buried, the admiration he let sour, the ghosts he never invited back. These were not feuds. They were fractures. And Dylan carried them not like trophies, but like scars. So who surprised you most on this list? Which of these silences do you think still lingers in Dylan's heart, unspoken but unresolved? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more untold stories from music's most mysterious legends, hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes, it is the voices we do not hear that carry the sharpest truths.